Hello， 大家好，我是 Penny。随着安倍首相的辞职呢，现在为了选出他继承人的辩论活动呢，也是如火如茶的进行中。那么今天呢，我们就来说一说他遗留下来的日本最严重的社会问题，那就是人口的下降。那2014年呢，全日本只有100万个新生儿出生。那按照这个速度呢，2060年我们将看到日本的人口从现在的12700万降至8700万。那么2040年呢，将会有近500个城镇消失。那日本的劳动力群体呢，也会随之下降。那么为了应对人口问题呢，日本当局也算是想尽了办法。那近年来我们也看到一些女性育儿手册在社会上流传。那么问题的根基呢，还是在日本的经济体系和文化。那近30%的女性呢表示，婚后她们将会成为全职的家庭主妇。那这就需要他们的配偶有一个长期比较稳定的工作，但日本的经济体现在不能给予他们这样的工作。那他们中间的大部分人呢，还是要依赖一些短期的和兼职的工作来维持生计。另一个群体的女性呢，由于日本守旧的企业文化和托儿服务的短缺，而放弃了结婚生子这条路。那如果他们选择了这条路呢，其实他们就要放弃自己的职业发展。那么剩下一部分人呢，虽说他们选择了结婚生子，但是由于育儿开销的增长呢，他们也不得不止步于只养一个孩子。那么安倍政府呢，在这个方面其实是有机会给年轻人更多的呼吸空间，让他们建立自己的家庭。但是取而代之的是呢，他们更鼓励女性兼顾事业跟家庭。那我们现在看到这样的策略成效并不是很显著。那么经济学家杂志呢，也就安倍在职时候的一些成就和后安倍时代的日本做了一期总结性的节目。那我们现在就去聽一聽吧。
On Friday, Abe Shinzo announced he would be standing down as Prime Minister of Japan.
病気と治療を抱え、体力が万全でないという苦痛の中、大切な政治判断を誤ること。
The 65-year-old has long suffered from a chronic bowel disease, but his condition has worsened. Mr. Abe said he didn't want his illness to get in the way of decision-making, and he apologized to the Japanese people for failing to complete his term in office. Last week, that term as Prime Minister became the longest since the post was created for a post-imperial Japan, and it isn't even his first time in the role. He'll remain until a successor is chosen, a successor who will face some pressing challenges.
So the press conference where Mr. Abe announced his decision to resign was somber, to say the least.
Noah Schneider is our Tokyo bureau chief.
I ran into one of his advisors who looked, to be honest, like someone had died. Even his inner circle, his closest associates, seemed shocked by this sharp turn of events. The Japanese press, meanwhile, was peppering the prime minister with questions primarily about his legacy, about the problems he left unresolved and the accomplishments that he felt most proud of.
Well, and about that legacy, how has Japan changed under Mr. Abe's leadership?
So Mr. Abe had a first brief stint as prime minister in 2006 and 2007 before stepping down because of the same chronic intestinal disease. When he took office again in 2012, he came in determined to revive the country's economy and its standing in the world.
So, ladies and gentlemen, Japan is back.
He famously declared that Japan is back in 2013. For Mr. Abe, that meant primarily an agenda of economic reform that came to be known as Abenomics. Monetary easing, fiscal stimulus, and structural reform were the so-called three arrows. And he also helped to beef up Japan's military, its self-defense forces. He proved an able manager of Japan's relations with the United States, especially after Donald Trump's election. It was quite telling, I thought, that the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison said that the region had lost a senior statesman after Abe announced his resignation.
And about the program of economic reform, the Abenomics, how successful has that been?
It's a mixed bag. On the one hand, the radical monetary easing that the Bank of Japan pursued did help pull the economy out of deflation, though it never quite hit its 2% inflation target. His program of reform helped inject a bit of life into the economy, but at the same time, this third arrow, the structural reforms, was probably the weakest piece of the Abenomics puzzle. He wasn't as successful at promoting female empowerment and also promoting digitalization in Japan's bureaucracy and its somewhat archaic corporate sector. Now, COVID has threatened to erase many of the gains that were made in the last 8 years. In fact, real GDP is now down to the level it was before Mr. Abe took office in 2012.
And what other challenges will his successor have to face?
Well, there are some enormous long-term structural challenges. First and foremost, shrinking population, a mounting gargantuan public debt, an anemic economy now, and an increasingly turbulent neighborhood with a rising China. What's more, there are several shorter-term problems to solve, managing the COVID-19 pandemic and figuring out whether Japan will be able to host the Olympic Games that were planned for this past summer.
And what about the hunt for that successor? How will that play out?
So Mr. Abe's successor will be decided inside the Liberal Democratic Party, the ruling party of Japan. This is going to be an insider's affair. And whoever does take over, whoever wins the leadership election that is expected to happen in the coming weeks, that person will rule until the end of Mr. Abe's current term, so until September of next year, and then face another party-wide general election. There are two candidates who are seen as possible transitional figures to serve out the remainder of Mr. Abe's term, namely the Deputy Prime Minister Aso Taro and the Chief Cabinet Secretary Suga Yoshihide. But that would only delay the eventual fight for the leadership of the party and the country at large. There are a number of figures who pop up in discussions about potential successors, former defense minister, former foreign minister, as well as the current defense and foreign ministers. And there will be a lot of jockeying in the weeks and months to come.
And so in that you see a smooth transition of power, no big changes to the agenda?
Well, the policy agenda may remain consistent. This succession will be decided on the basis of factional arithmetic and personalities rather than deep policy debates. But it may not be smooth. Historically, long-serving Japanese prime ministers have been followed by strings of short-lived, unpopular governments. Japan, in fact, cycled through 6 prime ministers in as many years, if you include Mr. Abe's first stint, before he came back in 2012. And in today's especially turbulent times, Japan can ill afford another bout of such instability.
Thanks very much for joining us, Noah.
Thanks for having me.